The evening of June 12th, 1848, began with such promise that Lady Arabella Fairfax would later marvel at how thoroughly hope could curdle into humiliation in the span of a single hour, for she had dressed with particular care that warm summer evening, choosing her finest ivory silk gown with its delicate Brussels lace trim and seed pearl embroidery. Her maid Clara arranging her chestnut hair in an elegant chignon with a few artful curls framing her face, and as she studied her reflection in the mirror of her bedchamber at Fairfax House, she had allowed herself a rare moment of vanity, thinking that perhaps tonight Sebastian Wentworth, the Duke of Ashford, her betrothed of 3 weeks, might finally look at her with something warmer than polite courtesy, might see her as more than the suitable alliance their families had arranged, might notice the way she had worn the amber pendant he had given her upon their engagement because it matched her eyes. The carriage ride to Vauxhall Gardens had been pleasant enough, Sebastian sitting across from her in his impeccably tailored evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from his aristocratic features, his grey eyes distant as they so often were, and Arabella had filled the silence with gentle observations about the weather and the upcoming season, receiving monosyllabic responses that she told herself were merely ducal reserve rather than indifference. For surely a man did not offer marriage, even an arranged one, without some regard for his intended bride. Vauxhall itself had stolen her breath when they arrived, the legendary pleasure gardens living up to every romantic description she had ever read, with hundreds of Chinese lanterns swaying like captured stars among the ancient elm trees, their coloured silk casting rose and gold and azure light across the gravel paths where London's elite paraded in their finest attire, orchestras playing from hidden pavilions so that music seemed to emanate from the very air itself, and above it all, fireworks burst in glittering cascades that drew gasps and applause from the assembled crowds. Sebastian had offered his arm with ducal formality, and they had promenaded along the grand walk where he acknowledged acquaintances with curt nods, introducing Arabella as his intended, with the warmth one might use to present a piece of furniture, and she had smiled graciously through each introduction, pretending not to notice the speculative looks, the raised eyebrows, the whispered comments that followed in their wake. For she knew what society thought of this match. A duke of ancient lineage and considerable fortune paired with the daughter of a baron, whose family was respectable but hardly distinguished, and she could read the questions in their eyes even if they dared not voice them aloud. She had hoped that once they left the crowds, Sebastian might relax, might show her the man beneath the title, and so when he suggested they walk the dark walk, she had agreed with. Perhaps too much enthusiasm, her heart beating faster at the intimacy such a suggestion implied, for the dark walk was famous as a place where couples sought privacy, where declarations were made and kisses stolen beneath the canopy of intertwined branches that blocked out the lantern light and created a tunnel of romantic shadow. The transition from the brilliantly lit main gardens to the dim corridor of trees was abrupt, the temperature dropping several degrees in the shade, the festive sounds of orchestra and laughter becoming muted and distant, and Arabella had felt Sebastian tense beside her, his arm rigid beneath her gloved hand, his pace quickening as though he wished to hurry through rather than linger, and she had felt the first stirring of unease, wondering if she had misread his intentions entirely. They had walked perhaps halfway down the quarter-mile avenue, passing other couples who were mere silhouettes in the scattered lamplight, their whispers and soft laughter emphasizing the strained silence between Arabella and Sebastian, when he stopped so abruptly that she stumbled against him, and his hand shot out to grip her arm with a strength that would leave bruises on her pale skin. His face turned away from her toward something or someone in the crowd ahead, and even in the dim light she could see the color drain from his features, could see the way his jaw clenched and his eyes widened with what looked like shock or perhaps terror. "Arabella, you must trust me," he said, his voice low and urgent, still not looking at her, his grip on her arm almost painful now. "Stay in this exact spot. Do not move, no matter what you hear." And she had tried to see what he was staring at, tried to understand the sudden panic in his tone. "Sebastian, "Please, what is wrong? Let me help you," she began, but he was already turning away. "You cannot help me with this. No one can," he said, and then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of masqueraders and evening strollers as though she had ceased to exist, leaving her standing alone in the shadows with her hand still raised from where it had slipped from his arm. The first few minutes, Arabella waited obediently, trusting that he would return momentarily, that some emergency had called him away, but that surely he would not leave his betrothed unattended in a public garden. But as 5 minutes became 10 and 10 became 20, confusion gave way to a creeping fear that settled cold in her stomach, for the dark walk that had seemed romantic moments before now felt menacing, the shadows deeper, the rustling of leaves in the night breeze sounding like whispered mockery, and the couples who passed her began to stare, their curious glances making her feel exposed and foolish, standing alone in her fine gown with no escort, no chaperone, no explanation for her solitary state. She tried to maintain her composure, lifting her chin and arranging her features into an expression of calm waiting, as though she had merely paused to admire the foliage or catch her breath, but inside she was a roiling mass of emotions. Hurt that Sebastian had left her without explanation, fear that something terrible had happened to him, and a growing, mortifying awareness that she had been abandoned, truly and completely abandoned, in the most public way possible. The lamplighters began their rounds as the hour grew late, but instead of lighting new lamps, they were extinguishing them, snuffing out the small pools of illumination one by one as Vauxhall prepared to close for the night, and Arabella realized with a surge of panic that she could not simply stand here until Sebastian returned, that she would have to find her own way out, would have to navigate the darkening gardens alone. She began to walk, her silk skirts rustling against the gravel path, her breathing shallow and quick, and the branches that had seemed merely atmospheric before now caught at her gown and hair, tearing the delicate fabric and pulling pins loose so that curls tumbled around her shoulders in disarray, and she felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall, refused to give in to the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. It was as she stumbled past a group of elegantly dressed matrons that she heard the whispers, not even bothering to lower their voices in her presence. "Poor dear, she does not even know about Georgiana yet. Some ghosts refuse to stay buried," one said with malicious pleasure, and another responded, "The Duke of Ashford's cast off, abandoned like common trash. What did she expect from a man still mourning his first love?" And Arabella felt the words like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fears, that she was not wanted, not cherished, merely a replacement for someone else, someone named Georgiana, whose ghost apparently held more claim to Sebastian's loyalty than his living, breathing betrothed. She made it to the main gates of Vauxhall through sheer force of will, her gown torn and dirty, her hair in complete disarray, her face pale and set, and she hired a hackney cab with coins from her reticule, giving the driver her address in a voice that shook only slightly. And during the long ride back to Mayfair, she sat in the darkness of the cab and felt something inside her shift and harden. The hopeful girl who had dressed so carefully that evening dying quietly and being replaced by someone else, someone who would not wait patiently to be claimed or discarded at a man's whim, someone who would demand answers and refuse to be a passive victim of circumstance. And by the time the cab pulled up before Fairfax House and she climbed the steps to face whatever awaited her inside, Lady Arabella Fairfax had made a decision. She would not accept this dismissal, this abandonment, this casual cruelty without understanding why. And if Sebastian Wentworth thought he could simply leave her in the dark without explanation, he was about to discover that she possessed a spine of steel beneath her silk gowns and ladylike manners. Arabella arrived at Fairfax House just past midnight to find every candle in the drawing-room blazing, and her father, Lord Edmund Fairfax, pacing the Turkish carpet with the controlled fury of a man who has been keeping his rage on a tight leash for hours. And the moment she stepped through the door, still dishevelled and dirty from her ordeal at Vauxhall, He whirled on her with eyes that were more worried than angry. "Thank God you are safe! Where is Ashford? What has happened?" he demanded. And she opened her mouth to explain, but he was already thrusting a folded piece of paper at her. "This arrived 3 hours ago, delivered by his servants. Read it." And Arabella took the note with trembling fingers and read the brief, devastating lines in Sebastian's distinctive hand. "The engagement is dissolved. The settlements will be honored. Forgive me." And that was all. No explanation, no apology beyond that single inadequate word, just a cold dismissal as though their betrothal had been a business arrangement that he had decided to terminate. Her father was raging now, his voice rising with each word. "We are ruined, Arabella. Do you understand? Ruined. The entire ton watched him parade you through Vauxhall and then abandon you. And now this insulting scrap of paper, as though you were some merchant's daughter he could simply pay off and forget. I will call him out. I will demand satisfaction. No man treats my daughter this way and escapes consequence." But Arabella barely heard him, her eyes fixed on that single word, "Forgive me," which suggested that Sebastian believed he had done something requiring forgiveness, that he was not simply a cruel man toying with her, but someone in pain, someone who had made a choice he knew would hurt her. And she found herself wanting to know why, needing to know why, because the Sebastian who had gripped her arm with such desperate urgency at Vauxhall was not the same man who had courted her with cool politeness these past weeks, and somewhere between those two versions of him lay the truth. She slept poorly that night, tossing in her bed as her mind replayed every moment of the evening, every word, every gesture, and in particular those whispered comments about Georgiana and ghosts refusing to stay buried. And by the time dawn broke over London, she had made her decision. She would not accept this dismissal without understanding it, would not allow Sebastian to simply disappear from her life, leaving only questions and humiliation in his wake. And so she rose and dressed in a simple day dress of dove-grey muslin. No elaborate styling, no attempt at beauty, just practical clothes for a woman on a mission, and she pinned her hair in a severe knot at the nape of her neck, and looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized, someone with steel in her spine and determination in her eyes. She told her maid she was going to visit her cousin and took a hackney cab to Mayfair, to the imposing stone facade of Ashford House with its black iron railings and perfectly maintained window boxes, and she marched up the front steps with her heart pounding but her face calm, and when the butler opened the door and informed her in tones of polite regret that his grace was not receiving visitors, she surprised both of them by pushing past him into the entrance hall. "I am not a visitor. I am his betrothed, or was until last night, and I will see him now," she said in a voice that brooked no argument. The butler, a dignified man of perhaps 60 years, looked genuinely distressed. "My lady, please, his grace has given strict instructions. He is not himself. Perhaps if you return another time." But Arabella was already moving toward the study. She knew where it was from her single chaperoned visit weeks ago, when Sebastian had shown her the house that would become her home, and she threw open the double doors without knocking and stepped into a scene of such disorder that she stopped short in shock. The study that had been immaculate during her previous visit was now in complete disarray. Papers scattered across every surface, books pulled from shelves and left open on chairs and tables, maps spread across the floor, and in the center of this chaos stood Sebastian Wentworth, the Duke of Ashford, looking nothing like the composed aristocrat who had escorted her to Vauxhall. His cravat was untied and hanging loose around his neck. His shirt was wrinkled and partially unbuttoned. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw. His hair was disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and on his desk sat 3 empty brandy glasses and a 4th that was half full, and he was staring at something on the wall with such intensity that he did not immediately notice her entrance. Arabella followed his gaze and felt her breath catch, for there on the wall, in a place of honor above the fireplace, hung a portrait of the most beautiful woman she had ever seen, a young lady of perhaps 20, with midnight black hair and extraordinary violet eyes, captured mid-laugh with her head tilted back and joy radiating from every brush stroke, and Arabella knew, without being told, that this was Georgiana, the ghost who refused to stay buried, the woman whose memory had driven Sebastian to abandon his betrothed in a dark garden. Sebastian must have heard the door, for he turned abruptly and his eyes widened in shock when he saw her. "Lady Fairfax," he said, his voice hoarse, and he tried to straighten, tried to reassemble some semblance of ducal authority, but his hands were shaking, and his eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked like a man who had not slept in days. "You should not be here. It is inappropriate. This is most irregular." But Arabella cut him off with a voice like ice. "You dissolved our engagement by note." "Your Grace, like dismissing a scullery maid, I have come to hear the words from your own lips." And she walked further into the room, stepping over scattered papers, until she stood directly in front of the portrait, studying it with the same calm intensity that Sebastian had shown moments before. "You left me in the dark for a ghost," she said quietly, still looking at the painted woman's laughing face. "I deserve to know why she has more claim to your loyalty than I do." And she turned to face him then, and Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him, which told her that her words had found their mark, that he felt the shame of what he had done even if he believed it justified. He tried to maintain his cold distance, attempted to fall back on the aristocratic reserve that had characterized their entire courtship. "This does not concern you, Lady Fairfax. Our engagement was a mistake, one I am rectifying. The settlements will be honored, and you will be free to make a more suitable match." But Arabella laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "You abandoned me in Vauxhall's dark walk like refuse, Your Grace. I believe we are far past propriety. Now tell me who she is, and why seeing her, or thinking you saw her, was worth destroying both our reputations." Something in Sebastian's facade cracked then. Perhaps it was her refusal to be dismissed, or perhaps it was simply that he had been carrying this burden alone for too long and needed to speak it aloud, and he sank into the chair behind his desk like a puppet with cut strings, his face in his hands, and when he spoke his voice was muffled and raw with emotion. "I saw her. Arabella. I saw Georgiana alive. After 3 years of believing her dead, of mourning her, of hating myself for not saving her. She was there, flesh and blood, not 10 yards away from us in the crowd, and I had to go to her. I had to know if it was real or if I had finally gone mad with grief." Arabella felt something shift inside her chest, felt her anger transmute into something more complicated, a mixture of sympathy and frustration and a strange, fierce determination, and she moved to the chair across from his desk and sat down without being invited, forcing him to look at her. "Tell me about her," she said. "Not a request, but a command. Tell me everything." And Sebastian raised his head and looked at her with eyes full of such pain that she almost regretted asking, but she held his gaze and waited. "Georgiana Tilney," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "the daughter of a vicar in the village near my family's country estate. I knew her from childhood. We grew up together. She was brilliant and kind and full of life, everything good in the world, and I loved her. I loved her from the time I was 15 years old, and she was 13. But my father forbade the match. She was too far beneath me, a vicar's daughter with no fortune and no connections. He had plans for me to marry an earl's daughter or a duke's, someone who would bring power and influence to the family. And so I waited. I told Georgiana to wait, to be patient, that when my father died and I inherited the title, I would marry her and damn the consequences." His hands were clenching and unclenching on the desk, his knuckles white, and Arabella could see the self-loathing in every line of his body as he continued. "My father died when I was 24, and I became the Duke of Ashford, and finally I was free to marry whom I chose. I sent for Georgiana, I planned our elopement, I bought her a ring." He gestured to the water-damaged locket on his desk. "And 3 days before we were to leave for Scotland, her carriage went off the bridge over the River Blackwater. It was raining, The roads were slick, the driver lost control, and the carriage plunged into the river, and they pulled the driver's body from the water. But Georgiana, he broke off, his voice cracking. Her body was never recovered. The river was high and fast from the rains. They searched for days but found nothing, and I had to bury an empty coffin and live with the knowledge that if I had married her sooner, if I had defied my father, if I had put her happiness above my inheritance, she would still be alive. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and guilt, and Arabella sat very still, processing this revelation, understanding now the shadows that had always lurked behind Sebastian's eyes, the sense that he was not fully present in their conversations, that some part of him was perpetually elsewhere, mourning a loss he believed he had caused. And she understood, too, why seeing Georgiana alive would drive him to madness, would make him abandon everything and everyone in a desperate attempt to reach her, to confirm that she was real, that his guilt had been for nothing, that she had not died because of his cowardice. "And did you catch her?" Arabella asked quietly, and Sebastian shook his head, his laugh bitter and broken. "No, she vanished like smoke. I searched the entire gardens. I questioned everyone I could find. I looked for hours, but it was as though she had never been there at all, and now I do not know if I truly saw her or if grief has finally consumed my reason, if my mind conjured her out of desperation because I cannot bear the weight of what I have done." Arabella leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Or perhaps she is alive." "Sebastian, perhaps she did not die in that accident. Perhaps the body was never recovered because there was no body to recover. And you owe it to yourself, and to me, to discover the truth, because you cannot live the rest of your life haunted by a ghost who might be flesh and blood, and you cannot ask me to simply accept my dismissal when there are so many unanswered questions." Sebastian looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not as the suitable bride his advisers had chosen, or the obligation he had tried to honor, but as the woman who had pushed her way into his study and demanded answers and refused to be sent away with platitudes and apologies. And something in his expression shifted. A crack, appearing in the wall he had built around his heart. "You should hate me," he said wonderingly. "I abandoned you, humiliated you, dissolved our engagement without explanation. Why are you still here? Why do you care what happened to Georgiana?" And Arabella stood, smoothing her skirts. "Because I refuse to be a footnote in someone else's tragedy, Your Grace. Because if my life is to be ruined by this, I will at least know the full story. And because, despite everything, I believe you are a better man than your actions last night suggest. And I would like to help you prove it, to yourself if not to me." And with that she turned and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle to look back at him. "I will return tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And we will begin investigating what happened to Georgiana Tilney. And if you are not here to meet me, if you send me away again, then you are the coward you believe yourself to be, and I will wash my hands of you entirely. But if you are here, if you are willing to face this mystery head-on, then perhaps we can find the truth together, and perhaps, when this is over, we can determine what, if anything, remains between us." And she left him sitting in his ruined study, staring after her with an expression of confused hope that he had not worn in 3 long years. Sebastian arrived at Ashford House the next morning at precisely 10 o'clock to find Arabella already waiting in the entrance hall, dressed in a practical walking dress of deep green cotton, with none of the elaborate trimmings that had characterized her evening gown at Vauxhall, her hair pulled back in a simple arrangement that suggested efficiency rather than fashion, and in her hands she held a leather satchel that looked decidedly unfeminine. And when he raised an eyebrow in question, she met his gaze with calm determination, and said, "I have taken the liberty of visiting the lending library on Piccadilly, and obtained several volumes on accidental death inquests and coroner's procedures. I thought we might begin by understanding what official investigation would have occurred at the time of the accident. and Sebastian felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration, for he had half expected her not to return, had thought that the cold light of morning would convince her that involving herself in his tragedy was madness. But here she was, prepared and organized and utterly serious about uncovering the truth. Their first destination was the bridge over the River Blackwater, a 3-hour carriage ride from London into the countryside near Sebastian's family estate, and the journey forced them into an intimacy that their previous courtship had never achieved. Sitting across from each other in the confined space of his travelling coach, no chaperone, because Arabella had declared that propriety had already been shattered beyond repair and she would not let artificial constraints limit their investigation, and at first they maintained a careful distance, speaking only of their plans and theories. But as the miles passed and London fell away behind them, Sebastian found himself studying her in the changing light that came through the carriage windows, noticing details he had overlooked during their formal courtship, the way she bit her lower lip when thinking deeply, the intelligence that shone in her amber eyes, the graceful strength of her hands as she took notes in a small journal she had brought for that purpose. The bridge itself was unremarkable in daylight, a sturdy stone structure with 3 arches spanning the river at a point where the water ran fast and deep, carved into a gorge by centuries of current, and Sebastian stood at the railing and looked down at the churning water below and felt the familiar weight of guilt settle over him like a shroud. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. "The carriage went through the railing there, where you can see the newer stonework where they repaired it. It was October and raining heavily. The driver testified that the horses spooked at something, a fox perhaps, and he lost control on the wet road, and the carriage went over and they pulled him from the water downstream. But Georgiana was never found." Arabella walked the length of the bridge slowly, examining the railing, the road surface, the sight lines, and then she surprised him by hiking up her skirts without shame and climbing down the steep bank to the water's edge, ignoring his protests. And he had no choice but to follow her, sliding on the loose stones in his expensive boots, and when he reached her she was standing at the very edge of the current, looking upstream and down with narrowed eyes. "The current is strong," she observed, "but not impossibly so, and the river is not particularly wide here. A strong swimmer could make it to shore. Could they not?" And Sebastian stared at her. The thought had never occurred to him. In his grief and guilt, he had simply accepted that Georgiana had drowned, but Arabella was right. Georgiana had been young and healthy, and if she had survived the initial impact, if she had not been knocked unconscious, she might have been able to swim to safety. They spent the next week visiting every location connected to Georgiana's supposed death. The vicar's old house, which was now occupied by a cheerful family who knew nothing of its history. The church where her empty coffin had been buried in the small graveyard behind the building. The local magistrate's office where the accident report had been filed. And at each stop, Arabella proved herself invaluable in ways that Sebastian could never have anticipated. For while his title and authority could open doors and demand cooperation, it also created walls of formality that prevented genuine conversation. But Arabella had a gift for putting people at ease, for asking questions that seemed like casual curiosity rather than formal interrogation. And her gender gave her access to servants and women who would never speak freely to a duke. It was a former kitchen maid at the vicar's house, now married to a local farmer, who provided their first real breakthrough. Arabella had tracked her down through patient questioning in the village, and had taken tea in her modest cottage while Sebastian waited outside. And when Arabella emerged an hour later, her eyes were bright with excitement. The maid remembers the vicar acting very strangely in the weeks after the funeral, she said as they walked back to their inn. He was suddenly flush with money, paid off debts he had owed for years, and then he left the parish entirely, claimed he needed to travel for his health, but he had never had money for travel before, and she remembered thinking it odd that a man who had just lost his only daughter would leave the place where her grave was. They returned to London, and Sebastian watched in fascination as Arabella transformed herself into an investigator, with a skill that suggested she had been wasted on drawing rooms and embroidery. She spent hours in the dusty archives of the Thames River Police, charming the clerk into letting her examine records that technically required official authorization. She visited the morgue and calmly discussed the procedures for identifying bodies recovered from the water with the coroner's assistant, while Sebastian stood in the corner fighting nausea. And she even convinced a parish clerk in Southwark to let her examine burial records in exchange for a sum of money that she produced from her reticule without blinking. It was these burial records that provided the smoking gun. "Sebastian, look at this," she said, spreading the ledger across the small desk in the clerk's office. "This is the entry for Georgiana Tilney, buried October 15th, 1845. But look at the ink. It is a different shade than the entries immediately before and after it, and the handwriting is similar but not identical. Someone made this entry later, weeks or perhaps months after the supposed burial. Someone wanted there to be an official record that she was buried here even though the coffin was empty." Sebastian leaned over her shoulder to examine the page and caught the scent of her hair, something floral and clean, and he had to force himself to focus on the writing rather than the warmth of her body so close to his. "Where did you learn to spot forgery?" he asked, genuinely impressed, and she smiled without looking up from the ledger. "My brother Charles was a terrible gambler. Your Grace, he would alter his vouchers and debts, trying to hide the extent of his losses from father. I learned to recognize his alterations before father could discover them. And there would be another terrible row. Every woman has her secrets." The investigation took them to increasingly unfashionable parts of London, to the docks at Southwark, where the Thames ran thick and brown between warehouses and wharves, to Whitechapel, where Arabella questioned a ferryman who had been working the river the month of the accident, and Sebastian found himself shedding his ducal bearing layer by layer, leaving behind the formal distance and aristocratic reserve that had defined him for so long. And in these rough neighbourhoods, he and Arabella moved through London as something closer to equals, partners in a shared enterprise. And he began to see her not as the suitable bride his advisers had selected, but as a person of remarkable courage and intelligence who had chosen to help him despite having every reason to despise him. It was during one of these excursions that the moment happened which Sebastian would replay in his mind 1,000 times afterward. They were walking along the slick cobblestones near Butler's Wharf, having just interviewed a dock worker who remembered seeing a well-dressed man paying for passage on a ship to Calais around the time of Georgiana's death, and Arabella was theorizing about whether the vicar might have sent his daughter to France, her words tumbling out in excitement when her foot slipped on the wet stones made treacherous by river spray and rain, and Sebastian's hands shot out instinctively and caught her around the waist, pulling her against his chest to keep her from falling, and time seemed to stop. Her face was inches from his, her hands braced against his shoulders, her lips slightly parted in surprise, and he could feel the rapid beat of her heart through the layers of her dress, could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. And for a moment he forgot everything, forgot Georgiana and guilt and grief, forgot that he had abandoned this woman in a dark garden and dissolved their engagement, forgot every reason why he should not be holding her like this, and he wanted desperately to close the distance between them, to kiss her, to claim her. But then reality crashed back, and he gently set her away, steadying her with hands that he hoped were not visibly shaking, and they continued walking as though nothing had happened, though the air between them hummed with unspoken tension. The storm caught them 3 days later when they were returning from Greenwich, where they had been examining shipping manifests. The summer sky that had been bright and clear all morning suddenly darkened with ominous clouds that rolled in from the east, and within minutes rain was sheeting down in torrents that turned the roads to rivers of mud, and their driver, seeking shelter, pulled the carriage off the main road and down a narrow track that led to the river, to an abandoned boathouse that leaned drunkenly over the water, its weathered wood silvered by age and neglect. And Sebastian helped Arabella down from the carriage and they ran through the downpour to the dubious shelter of the structure, pushing open the door that hung askew on rusted hinges and stepping into a space that smelled of tar and river water and rot. The boathouse was a single large room with a few old crates stacked against the walls and a gap in the floor where boats would once have been launched directly into the Thames, and through this gap they could see the river, its surface pocked and dancing with rain, and the sound of the storm was deafening on the wooden roof, a drumming that made conversation nearly impossible. But after a few minutes the worst of the deluge passed, and the rain settled into a steady rhythm, and they found themselves sitting on two crates pushed together, Sebastian having draped his coat over Arabella's shoulders because the temperature had dropped with the rain, and she was shivering in her thin dress. And in the dim grey light that filtered through the dirty windows, they looked at each other and something unspoken passed between them. "I was a coward," Sebastian said abruptly, the words bursting from him as though he could no longer contain them. "With Georgiana, I told her to wait, to be patient. I chose my father's approval over her happiness. I let him dictate whom I could love and when I could marry. And when he died and I was finally free, it was too late. She was gone, and I have spent 3 years hating myself for that weakness, for valuing my inheritance more than the woman I claimed to love, and when I thought I saw her at Vauxhall, alive, I had to go to her. I had to know if I could somehow make it right, if I could undo my cowardice. And I never thought, never considered what it would mean for you, what it would do to you to be left standing alone in the dark." Arabella was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain sheet across the river, and when she spoke her voice was soft but steady. "Loving someone is not weakness, Sebastian. Abandoning them is. You made a choice based on fear and duty. And yes, it was perhaps the wrong choice, but you were young and under tremendous pressure, and you cannot spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for being human, for having made a mistake." And she turned to look at him, her face serious in the half-light. "Is that what you did to me at Vauxhall? Abandoned me?" And Sebastian felt the word like a physical blow. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "Yes, that is exactly what I did. I abandoned you, just as I abandoned her. And I am so deeply sorry, Arabella. Sorrier than I have words to express." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cool and slender against his palm. "But you are here now," she said, "letting me see the truth of you, letting me help you search for answers. That matters, Sebastian. That counts for something." And he stared at their joined hands and felt something in his chest crack open, a wall he had built around his heart beginning to crumble. And he realized that, somewhere during these weeks of investigation, somewhere between the bridge and the burial records and the docks, he had begun to feel something for this woman that had nothing to do with duty or arrangement, and everything to do with her sharp mind and steadfast courage, and the way she refused to let him wallow in his guilt. "I have never felt truly seen before," Arabella said, still holding his hand, her thumb tracing small circles on his palm. "I have always been the Fairfax daughter, or suitable duchess material, or a political alliance that would benefit both families. But no one has ever looked at me and seen me, Arabella, the person beneath the title and the expectations. And I think that is why I could not simply walk away when you ended our engagement, because for the first time in my life, I wanted to be seen, wanted to be chosen, not for what I could bring to a marriage, but for who I am. And even though you left me in the dark, even though you humiliated me, I saw something in your eyes that night, some desperate pain that suggested you were suffering too, and I wanted to understand it, to help you if I could, because perhaps in helping you I could help myself, could prove that I am more than just suitable and undemanding." Sebastian turned to her, his free hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I see you, Arabella," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I see your courage and your intelligence and your stubborn refusal to accept easy answers. I see the way you walked into my study and demanded the truth, The way you have thrown yourself into this investigation without a thought for propriety or reputation, the way you slipped on those cobblestones and laughed instead of crying, the way you bribed that parish clerk and charmed that ferryman and examined burial records without flinching. I see you, and you are extraordinary, and I have no right to feel what I am feeling for you, not while Georgiana's ghost stands between us, not while I do not know if she is alive or dead, not while I still carry all this guilt and grief. But God help me, I am feeling it anyway. They were so close now, their faces inches apart, the rain drumming overhead, and the river rushing below, and the world narrowed to just the two of them in this abandoned boathouse. And Sebastian could feel her breath on his lips, could see the pulse beating in her throat, and he wanted to kiss her with an intensity that shook him. But even as he began to close the distance between them, even as her eyes fluttered closed in anticipation, he stopped, his forehead resting against hers, but his lips not quite touching hers. "I cannot," he whispered. "Not yet. Not until I know the truth about Georgiana. Not until I can come to you with my whole heart, not haunted by the past. You deserve that, Arabella. You deserve everything, and I will not give you half measures." She opened her eyes, and he saw tears there, but also understanding. "Then let us lay that ghost to rest," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Together, Sebastian, let us find the truth and put the past behind you. And then, when this is over, we can see what remains between us, if anything, and whether it is enough to build a future on." And he nodded, not trusting himself to speak. And they sat there in the boathouse, with the storm raging around them, holding hands and resting foreheads together, not kissing but connected nonetheless. Two people who had been brought together by arrangement, but were being forged into something real by shared purpose and growing understanding. And when the rain finally stopped and they emerged into the clean, washed afternoon, Sebastian felt as though he had passed through something transformative, as though the investigation into Georgiana's death had become less about assuaging his guilt and more about freeing himself to love the woman who walked beside him, the woman who had refused to let him destroy himself with grief and had instead offered him partnership and patience and the promise of something better if he could only find the courage to reach for it. The lead came from an unexpected source, a leather-bound journal discovered in a box of donated books at a church charity sale in Cheapside, and Arabella had been the one to find it, spending her afternoons methodically going through every donation that had come from churches in the counties surrounding London, looking for any connection to Georgiana's father, and when she opened this particular volume and saw the name Reverend Thomas Tilney inscribed on the first page in fading ink, her hands had trembled with excitement, and she had spent the next 2 hours reading entries that chronicled the months following Georgiana's supposed death, entries filled with guilt and justification and prayers for forgiveness. And buried in those rambling confessions was a single crucial detail, a reference to a cottage in a coastal village in Kent, a place where the Reverend had written that he might find peace and solitude to contemplate his sins. They left for Kent the next morning, taking Sebastian's fastest carriage and driving through the summer countryside with a sense of urgency that made conversation impossible, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. And Arabella watched Sebastian's profile as he stared out of the window at the passing fields and hedgerows, seeing the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his knees, and she wondered what he was feeling, whether he hoped to find answers or feared them, whether the prospect of discovering that Georgiana might be alive filled him with joy or dread, or some complicated mixture of both. The village was exactly as melancholy as the journal had suggested, a collection of grey stone cottages clinging to the white cliffs above the channel, wind-swept and isolated, the kind of place where people came to disappear from the world, and the salt air was sharp and clean, carrying the cries of gulls and the constant rush of waves against rocks far below, and as they asked directions from the taciturn locals, Arabella felt a growing sense of foreboding, a certainty that whatever they discovered here would change everything between her and Sebastian, would force choices that neither of them was ready to make. The cottage stood at the edge of the village, separated from its neighbors by a stretch of wild grass starred with late summer wildflowers, and it was small and spare, its windows dark, its garden overgrown. And when they knocked on the weathered door, there was a long silence before shuffling footsteps approached from within, and the door opened to reveal a man who had aged a decade in 3 years. Reverend Tilney was gaunt and bent, his face grey with illness, his eyes sunken but burning with a feverish intensity. And when he saw Sebastian standing on his threshold, his face went even paler, and he staggered backward as though he had seen a ghost himself. "Your Grace," he whispered, his voice a rasp of damaged lungs. "I knew you would come eventually. I have been waiting, dreading this day. Please, come in, let me tell you everything before God calls me to account for my sins." The interior of the cottage was as spare as a monk's cell, a single room with a narrow bed, a table, a chair, and shelves lined with religious texts. And on every available surface were images of Georgiana, sketches and paintings, and a miniature portrait in a silver frame, a shrine to a daughter who was not dead, but whom the Reverend had lost none the less. And the smell of sickness hung heavy in the air, the sweet rot of tuberculosis, and Sebastian had to steel himself to enter, to sit in the chair that the Reverend indicated, while Arabella stood by the door, watching and listening and feeling her heart break in advance for what was coming. "She did not die," the Reverend said without preamble, collapsing onto his bed and clutching the miniature portrait to his chest. "My Georgiana, my beautiful girl. She did not die in the accident. She survived. God help us both, she survived. But she was gravely injured. Her face, her neck. The doctors said she would bear the scars forever. And when she saw herself in the mirror, when she understood what she had become, she begged me to help her disappear. She said she could not bear for you to see her like that, could not endure the thought of you marrying her out of pity or duty rather than love." Sebastian had gone completely still, his face drained of color, his eyes fixed on the Reverend with an intensity that was almost frightening, and Arabella could see his hands shaking where they gripped the arms of the chair, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. She was alive. All this time, 3 years. And you let me believe she was dead. You let me mourn her. You staged a funeral and buried an empty coffin and watched me destroy myself with guilt. And for what? Because she was ashamed of scars. Because she thought I was too shallow to love her unless she was perfect. The Reverend was weeping now, tears streaming down his wasted face, his breath coming in labored gasps. "She made me swear, Your Grace," she said. "You would marry her out of duty, out of guilt for her scars. She wanted to be loved for herself, not pitied for what she had lost. And I, God forgive me, I agreed. I sold the church silver to get the money. I paid a doctor to falsify the death certificate. I arranged for her passage to France, to Paris, where she could start a new life. And I have lived with that choice every day since, have felt it eating at my soul, like this disease eats at my lungs." Sebastian stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor, and he began to pace the small room like a caged animal, his movements jerky and uncontrolled, and Arabella could see the war playing out across his features, shock giving way to disbelief, giving way to anguish, giving way to anger. And she wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but she knew this was something he had to process alone. This revelation that his guilt had been for nothing, that the woman he had mourned had chosen to leave him, had made the decision for both of them without trusting him enough to let him choose. "Did she not trust me enough to let me make that choice?" Sebastian said, his voice rising. "Did she not know me well enough to understand that I would have loved her regardless, that her face was the least important thing about her, or did she simply not love me enough to let me prove it?" And the Reverend shook his head weakly. "She loved you enough not to burden you with it, Your Grace. She loved you enough to set you free." to let you find a bride who could be a proper duchess, who could stand beside you without shame." And Sebastian laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "She left me in chains. Reverend, chains of guilt and grief that have bound me for 3 years. Do not speak to me of freedom." Arabella stepped forward then, her voice quiet but steady. "Where is she now?" And the Reverend fumbled in the drawer of his bedside table and withdrew a folded paper. "This is the address in Paris where she has been living. She teaches music to the daughters of wealthy families. She has built a life for herself, a quiet life. And she has asked me not to contact her, not to tell anyone where she is, but I am dying, and I cannot take this secret to my grave. I cannot face my God knowing that I helped her perpetrate this deception." And he held out the paper to Sebastian with a trembling hand. "You deserve to know. Your Grace, you deserve the chance to see her, to hear the truth from her own lips, to make your own choice about what happens next." Sebastian took the paper but did not look at it, his eyes still fixed on the Reverend's face, and then he turned and walked out of the cottage without a word, leaving Arabella to murmur hasty thanks and farewells before following him into the late afternoon sunlight. And she found him standing at the edge of the cliff, staring out at the grey-green channel with the wind whipping his hair and the gulls crying overhead, and she approached him slowly, giving him time to speak if he wanted to. But he remained silent, the paper clutched in his hand, and finally she asked, "What will you do?" They took rooms at the village's only coaching inn, a low-ceilinged establishment with uneven floors and small windows that looked out over the sea. And they ordered dinner sent up, but neither of them could eat, the food sitting untouched on the table between them, while Sebastian paced, and Arabella sat rigidly in the chair by the window, watching the sun set over the water and feeling her world crumbling around her. For she knew what was coming, knew that Sebastian would have to go to Georgiana, would have to see her and speak with her and decide what he felt. And she knew, too, that once he saw his first love alive and well, once he looked into those violet eyes that haunted his portrait, there was every chance he would choose the past over the future, would choose the woman he had loved since boyhood over the woman who had been thrust upon him by duty and arrangement. "You are angry with her," Arabella said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. And Sebastian stopped pacing and turned to her, his face haggard in the candlelight. "Of course I am angry," he said, his voice raw. 3 years, Arabella. 3 years I have carried the weight of her death like a stone around my neck. I have denied myself any chance of happiness, because I believed I did not deserve it. I have punished myself every day for my cowardice in not marrying her sooner, and all the while she was alive, living in Paris, teaching music, making that choice for me without giving me any say in the matter. How can I not be angry?" Arabella rose and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "Perhaps she was protecting you," she said softly. "Or perhaps she was protecting herself. Perhaps she could not bear to see pity in your eyes when you looked at her scars. Perhaps she loved you enough to want you to remember her as she was, beautiful and whole, rather than broken and scarred. We cannot know her reasoning unless you ask her." And Sebastian pulled his hands free and resumed his pacing. "I do not know if I want to ask her," he said. "I do not know if I want to see her at all. What would I say? Thank you for letting me believe you were dead. Thank you for letting me destroy myself with guilt. Thank you for making me into this haunted shell of a man who cannot move forward because he is too busy looking backward." They argued through the long night, their voices rising and falling with the intensity of their emotions, and it was the most honest they had been with each other since this entire ordeal began, with no politeness or restraint to soften the sharp edges of their feelings, and Sebastian confessed things he had never said aloud, that he did not know if he had ever truly loved Georgiana, or if he had loved the idea of her, the romance of defying his father, the thrill of forbidden passion that he had spent 3 years mourning not just the woman, but his own lost youth and idealism, and Arabella listened and ached for him. But she also felt her own fear rising like a tide, for if he went to Georgiana, if he saw her and spoke with her and achieved the closure he needed, there was no guarantee that he would return to Arabella, no promise that what had been growing between them these past weeks would be enough to compete with the pull of first love and redemption. "I do not love her any more," Sebastian said finally, as the candle burned low and the first light of dawn began to grey the windows, his voice exhausted but certain. "I do not know if I ever truly did, or if it was the idea of defying my father, of choosing passion over duty. But I need to see her, Arabella. I need to understand why she did what she did. I need to hear her tell me that she chose to leave, that it was her decision and not my failure. Because until I do that, until I look her in the eye and ask her those questions, I will never be free of this." And Arabella nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "I know," she said. "That is why you must go. You will never be able to move forward until you have faced your past, until you have laid this ghost to rest once and for all." The letter arrived the next morning, delivered by a courier who had ridden through the night from London, and it was addressed to Sebastian in a feminine hand that Arabella did not recognize. And when he opened it and read the contents, his face went white, and he handed the paper to Arabella without a word, and she read the brief message written in elegant script. "I have learned of your investigation. I have returned to England. I must speak with you. Please meet me tomorrow evening at Vauxhall Gardens, at the Dark Walk, where we first spoke of love so many years ago. Come alone. I beg you. There are things I must explain, things I must say that cannot be written in a letter. Yours always, Georgiana." The symbolism was not lost on either of them. Vauxhall, the Dark Walk, the place where Sebastian had abandoned Arabella just weeks ago, and now Georgiana was asking him to meet her there, asking him to return to the scene of one betrayal to confront another. And Arabella felt something twist in her chest, a sharp pain that might have been jealousy or fear, or simply the certainty that she was about to lose him, that he would go to Georgiana and see her alive, and hear her explanations, and remember all the reasons he had loved her, and the fragile connection that had been building between him and Arabella would shatter like glass. "She wants to meet at Vauxhall," Sebastian said, his voice hollow. "At the Dark Walk, where I left you." And Arabella managed a sad smile. "She has a sense of poetry," she said, "or cruelty, perhaps both." And Sebastian looked at her with eyes full of anguish. "Arabella, if I go to her, if I meet her there, what becomes of us?" And Arabella felt tears threaten, but refused to let them fall. "There is no us until you know your own heart." "Your Grace," she said, using his title deliberately to create distance, to protect herself from the pain of hoping, "you must go to her. You must hear what she has to say. You must decide what you feel and what you want, and only then can we determine if there is anything left between us, if what we have built these past weeks is strong enough to survive the return of your first love." They returned to London in silence, the carriage carrying them back through the same countryside they had travelled with such hope and urgency just days before. But now everything had changed. The revelation of Georgiana's survival had shifted the ground beneath them, had turned their investigation from a shared quest into something more complicated and painful, a reckoning that would force Sebastian to choose between his past and his future, between the ghost he had mourned and the woman who had stood beside him in the search for truth. And Arabella sat across from him and watched his face and tried to memorize every detail, the way his brow furrowed when he was thinking, the set of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes from lack of sleep, because she knew, even if she did not want to admit it, that this might be the last time they were together like this, partners and almost lovers, before everything changed. When they reached London, Sebastian saw her to her door at Fairfax House, and they stood on the steps in the twilight, neither wanting to say goodbye but knowing they must. And finally Sebastian took her hands in his grip tight and desperate. "I do not want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking. These weeks with you, this partnership we have built, it has meant more to me than I can say. You have given me purpose and hope when I thought I had neither, and I cannot bear the thought of walking away from that. From you. And Arabella squeezed his hands and forced herself to smile. Then do not walk away, she said. Go to Georgiana, hear what she has to say, make your peace with the past, and then if you still want me, if you still believe there is something worth pursuing between us, come back to me. Come back and we will build something new together, something not haunted by ghosts or guilt. But Sebastian, and she took a breath, steadying herself for what she had to say next. If you go to her and realize that she is what you want, that the love you shared is what you have been searching for all along, then I release you. I will not hold you to an engagement that was arranged by others. I will not trap you with duty or obligation. I want you to be free to choose, truly choose, and whatever you decide, I will accept it with grace. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly against his chest, and she could feel his heart pounding, could feel the tremor that ran through his body, and for a long moment they stood there in the gathering darkness, two people on the precipice of losing everything or gaining it all. And then he released her and stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. Tomorrow night, he said, I will go to her tomorrow night, and when it is done, when I know the truth and have made my peace, I will come to you. I will tell you what I have decided, and I swear to you, Arabella, whatever choice I make, it will be the truth of my heart, not duty or guilt or obligation, but what I truly want, what I truly feel. And she nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and she watched him walk down the steps and climb into his carriage, watched until it disappeared around the corner, and then she went inside and climbed the stairs to her room and finally allowed herself to cry, great wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, because she knew that tomorrow night Sebastian would meet Georgiana in the dark walk at Vauxhall, the place where their story had begun, and when he did, he would have to choose between the woman he had loved first and the woman he might love last, and Arabella could do nothing but wait and hope and pray that the connection they had built was strong enough to survive the return of a ghost made flesh. Sebastian arrived at Vauxhall Gardens as the summer sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and he walked through the entrance gates with his heart hammering against his ribs and his hands clenched at his sides, every step taking him closer to a confrontation he both needed and dreaded. For somewhere in these gardens Georgiana was waiting, the woman he had mourned for 3 years, the ghost made flesh, and he knew that what happened in the next hour would determine the course of the rest of his life. The gardens were beginning to fill with early evening visitors, families promenading before dinner, young couples seeking the romance of the pleasure grounds, and Sebastian moved through them like a man in a dream, barely seeing the familiar paths and pavilions, his entire being focused on the dark walk ahead, that quarter-mile of shadowed avenue where he had abandoned Arabella just weeks ago, where he had chosen panic over loyalty and left the woman who would become his salvation standing alone in the darkness. And now he was returning to face another woman, another choice, another chance to choose correctly or fail utterly. She was waiting at the midpoint of the dark walk, exactly where he had left Arabella, a slender figure in a dark cloak with a veil covering her face, and as Sebastian approached, she turned toward him, and he could see her trembling even from a distance, could sense the fear and hope radiating from her in equal measure. And he stopped a few feet away, giving her space, giving them both time to adjust to this impossible reunion. And for a long moment they simply stood there in the gathering shadows, while the sounds of the gardens faded around them, and the world narrowed to just the two of them, and the weight of 3 years of grief and deception. Georgiana raised her hands to her veil with fingers that shook visibly, and Sebastian found himself holding his breath, not knowing what he would see, what he would feel, whether the sight of her would resurrect the love he thought he had buried, or confirm what he had begun to suspect during these weeks with Arabella. That the Georgiana he had loved existed only in memory, idealized and frozen in time, bearing little resemblance to the living, breathing woman who stood before him now. The veil fell away, and Sebastian felt his breath catch, not from horror, but from the shock of recognition mixed with the evidence of suffering, for Georgiana's face was indeed marked by the accident, a network of fine white scars traced along her left jaw and down her neck, some barely visible, others more pronounced, creating a delicate webwork that caught the fading light, and her skin had the pallor of someone who had spent years avoiding mirrors and scrutiny. But her eyes were the same, those extraordinary violet eyes that had haunted his portrait and his dreams, and her features were still beautiful despite the scars, still recognizably the girl he had loved. And Sebastian felt a wave of compassion wash over him, not pity but genuine sorrow for what she had endured, for the pain she had suffered, both physical and emotional. "This is what I spared you from," Georgiana said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady, lacking the tremor that had shaken her hands. "This is why I left. Why I could not come back to you, why I begged my father to help me disappear. I could not bear the thought of you looking at me with pity, of you marrying me out of duty or guilt, when what I wanted, what I had always wanted, was to be loved for myself, to be desired, not endured." And Sebastian stepped forward instinctively, his hand reaching out but stopping short of touching her face, and he shook his head slowly, his voice gentle but firm when he spoke. "You should have let me make that choice. Georgiana," he said, "not the choice of whether to marry you despite your scars, but the choice to love you regardless of them. You took that from both of us. You decided for me what I could or could not handle, what I would or would not feel. And that was not your right, no matter how much pain you were in, no matter how afraid you were." And Georgiana's eyes filled with tears that did not fall, and she nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered. "I know that now. I have known it for 3 years. But in that moment, lying in my bed in agony, overhearing the surgeon tell my father that I would be scarred forever, that my face would never be the same, all I could think was that I would become a burden to you, that you would marry me because you felt you had to, because you had made promises, and I could not bear it, Sebastian. I could not bear to see love turn to obligation, passion turn to duty." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging between them, and Sebastian felt the old guilt try to reassert itself, the familiar refrain that he should have fought harder, married her sooner, prevented the accident through sheer force of will. But for the first time in 3 years, that guilt found no purchase, for he could see now with painful clarity that Georgiana's choice had been her own, that she had made it for her own reasons, and while he could wish she had trusted him enough to let him prove his love, he could not take responsibility for a decision that had been entirely hers to make. "Would you have?" Georgiana asked, her voice stronger now, a hint of challenge beneath the pain. "Loved me regardless. If you had seen me like this in the days after the accident, bandaged and broken and screaming in pain, would you have still wanted to marry me? Still looked at me with desire instead of pity?" And Sebastian took a long breath, considering his answer carefully, wanting to give her honesty rather than empty comfort. And after a pause he spoke the truth that he had only recently come to understand. "I want to say yes," he said slowly. "But truthfully, I do not know, Georgiana. We were so young, our love was tangled up in rebellion and romance, in the thrill of defying my father and choosing passion over duty. I do not know if it would have survived the reality of your injuries, the long recovery, the stares and whispers from society. I would like to believe I would have been strong enough, noble enough, but I cannot say with certainty, and perhaps that is the most honest thing I can tell you, that the boy who loved you might have failed you just as badly as you feared. Georgiana closed her eyes briefly, and a single tear escaped to track down her scarred cheek, and when she opened them again, there was a sad acceptance in her gaze. "We were children playing at being adults," she said, "playing at grand passion and eternal devotion. We did not know what love really meant, what it required, what it cost, and when reality intruded in the form of my accident, we both failed. I failed by running away, and you failed by letting your father control you for so long, and we cannot go back and change those failures. We can only acknowledge them and try to move forward." "And now?" Sebastian asked quietly, and Georgiana met his eyes, searching his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Could we?" she began. "Could we try again? Start fresh? You know the truth now. You see me as I am, scarred but alive, and I have learned so much in these 3 years. I have built a life in Paris. I teach music, and I have found a measure of peace. But when I saw you at Vauxhall that night, when I saw you in your ducal finery with your beautiful bride on your arm, all of that peace shattered, and I realized I had made a terrible mistake, that I had thrown away something precious out of fear. And I came back. Sebastian, I came back to England to see you, to ask if there might be a second chance for us." The words hung in the air between them, a question and an offer and a plea all at once, and Sebastian felt his heart constrict, not with the resurrected love she was hoping for, but with a complicated mixture of compassion and regret and absolute certainty, and he knew his answer before he consciously formed the words, knew it in the way his mind immediately conjured, not Georgiana's face but Arabella's, not the violet eyes before him but amber eyes full of intelligence and courage, not the woman of his past but the woman of his present and future. "No," he said gently, and Georgiana flinched as though he had struck her, but he continued, his voice steady and sure. "Not because of your scars, Georgiana. They do not repel me. They are simply marks of what you have survived, but because I am in love with someone else. Someone who saw me at my absolute worst, broken and grieving and half mad with guilt, and chose to help me become better. Someone I abandoned in this very spot, in this dark walk, and who somehow forgave me enough to stand beside me these past weeks while we searched for you, while we uncovered the truth of what happened." "Lady Arabella Fairfax," Georgiana said, not a question but a statement, and her voice held a note of sad understanding. "I saw how you looked at her that night at Vauxhall, saw the way your eyes followed her even as you were walking toward me, and I envied her, Sebastian, envied the fact that she had your attention in a way I never truly did, even when we were young and supposedly in love." And Sebastian nodded slowly, realizing the truth of her observation. For even in their courtship he had been more focused on defying his father than on truly knowing Georgiana, had been in love with the idea of rebellion rather than the reality of the woman. "She deserves better than my half-heart, still chained to the past," Sebastian said, his voice breaking slightly. "She deserves everything, my whole heart, my full attention, my complete devotion, and I have lost her, Georgiana. I have lost her because I could not let go of you, could not stop punishing myself for failures both real and imagined, and now she has sent me here to make my choice, and I am choosing her. I am choosing the future over the past, but I fear it is too late, that she will not want me after all of this, after I have put her through this ordeal." Georgiana was crying openly now, but she managed a tremulous smile. "Then stop standing here with a ghost." "Sebastian," she said, echoing words that Arabella herself might have spoken. "Go to her. Give her what you could not give me, your whole heart, freely offered, not bound by duty or guilt or obligation, but given because you choose to give it, because you want to give it. And perhaps if you are very lucky and very honest, she will accept it." And she stepped forward and rose on her toes to press a kiss to his forehead, a benediction and a farewell. And then she drew her veil back over her face, and walked away down the dark walk, disappearing into the gathering shadows. And Sebastian watched her go, and felt the weight of 3 years of grief and guilt finally lift from his shoulders, felt himself become lighter, freer, as though he had been carrying a stone and had finally been given permission to set it down. He stood alone in the dark walk as the last light faded from the sky and the lamplighters began their evening rounds, moving through Vauxhall with their long poles, touching flame to wick, and one by one the lanterns began to glow, transforming the gardens from twilight into a fairy realm of coloured light. And Sebastian watched this transformation and felt something click into place in his mind, a wild, desperate, absolutely necessary idea that made his heart race and his hands shake with a mixture of fear and hope. He found the Vauxhall Gardens master in his office near the main pavilion, a portly man named Chester, who had been managing the pleasure grounds for 20 years and prided himself on having seen every form of aristocratic excess and eccentricity. But even he looked startled when the Duke of Ashford burst through his door with wild eyes and dishevelled hair and began making demands that bordered on insanity. "I want every lamp in the dark walk lit," Sebastian said without preamble. "Not just lit, but doubled, tripled. I want 1,000 lanterns commissioned and hung before tomorrow evening. Chinese lanterns, crystal chandeliers, candelabras, anything and everything that can hold a flame. I want that avenue transformed into a corridor of light unlike anything London has ever seen." And Chester stared at him as though he had gone mad. "Your Grace, that is impossible. We do not have that many lanterns. We could not procure them in time, and the expense would be astronomical." But Sebastian cut him off, pulling a purse heavy with gold from his pocket and dropping it on the desk with a thud that made the papers jump. "I do not care about the expense," Sebastian said, his voice intense and urgent. "I will pay whatever it costs. I will pay double, triple. I will bankrupt myself if necessary, but I need this done. I need the dark walk to be transformed by tomorrow evening. I need it to be so bright that it can be seen from across London, a beacon, a declaration, a promise." And Chester looked at the purse, and then at the Duke's face, and saw something there that convinced him this was not mere aristocratic whim, but desperate necessity. "Very well, Your Grace," he said slowly. "I will send messengers to every chandler and lampmaker in London. I will have my men working through the night, but I make no promises. 1,000 lanterns is a considerable undertaking." And Sebastian nodded, gripping the man's hand with both of his own. "Do your best," he said. "Do your best, and I will be forever in your debt." And then he was gone, striding out into the gardens with a sense of purpose he had not felt in 3 years, perhaps in his entire life. He spent the night working alongside Chester's men, sending urgent messages to every contact he had in London, calling in favours from chandlers and lamp-makers, commissioning artisans to create special pieces, and he worked with his own hands as well, hanging lanterns from tree branches, stringing lights along the paths, testing wicks and trimming candles. And the other workers stared at him in amazement, for it was unheard of for a duke to labour like a common servant. But Sebastian did not care about dignity or propriety, cared only about creating something beautiful enough, grand enough, to prove to Arabella that he had changed, that he was no longer the man who had abandoned her in darkness, but someone willing to create light, willing to risk everything for love. As dawn broke over London, Sebastian stood at the entrance to the dark walk and surveyed what they had created. And even exhausted and covered in soot and candle wax, he felt his breath catch at the sight, for the quarter-mile avenue had been completely transformed, every tree hung with dozens of Chinese silk lanterns in jewel colours that would glow like captured stars, crystal chandeliers suspended from the strongest branches to catch and multiply the light, candelabras lining both sides of the path creating a river of flame. And woven through the foliage were thousands of tiny lights that would make the entire corridor shimmer and dance. And it was beautiful, more beautiful than he had imagined, a tunnel of light where darkness had once reigned, a physical manifestation of the transformation he hoped had occurred in his own heart. Now, he thought, now I must convince Arabella to come see it, must find the words to ask her for one more chance, one more opportunity to prove that I am worthy of her love. And as the sun climbed higher and the workers began to disperse, Sebastian walked slowly back through the gardens toward his waiting carriage, rehearsing and discarding a dozen different speeches, trying to find the perfect words to convey everything he felt, everything he had learned, everything he wanted to promise, and knowing that whatever he said, it would not be enough, that only the lights themselves, only the grand gesture of transforming darkness into beauty, could possibly communicate the depth of his love and the sincerity of his transformation, and he prayed, harder than he had prayed for anything in his life, that it would be enough, that Arabella would see what he had created and understand what he was trying to say, that she would give him the chance he did not deserve, but desperately needed, the chance to love her the way she deserved to be loved, completely and without reservation, with his whole heart and his whole self no longer haunted by the past, but free to embrace the future they could build together. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Arabella stood in the drawing room of Fairfax House the following evening, turning the small cream-colored card over and over in her hands, reading the message for perhaps the 20th time since the Duke's footman had delivered it an hour ago, and each time the words seemed to shift in meaning, to promise something different, to offer hope or heartbreak in equal measure depending on how she chose to interpret them. Come to Vauxhall Gardens at dusk. Come alone. Trust me one last time. S. And those final 4 words were what held her captive, what made her heart race and her hands tremble, for they implied finality, an ending, one last request before whatever came next, and she could not decide if that ending would be his goodbye. I have chosen Georgiana, I am sorry, I wish you well, or something else entirely, something she barely dared to imagine. She had dressed simply, almost defiantly so, in a cream muslin gown with minimal ornamentation, her hair pulled back in an elegant but uncomplicated style, for she was done trying to be what others wanted her to be, done with grand gestures and careful performances. If Sebastian wanted to see her, it would be as herself, plain and honest and refusing to compete with a ghost. And if that was not enough, then it had never been enough, and she would go home and cry for a week, and then somehow find a way to move forward with her life, to find contentment, if not joy, to be the spinster aunt who smiled too brightly, and whose eyes held a permanent shadow of what might have been. But even as she told herself she was prepared for heartbreak, even as she rehearsed in her mind how she would respond with dignity when he told her he could not let Georgiana go, some small, stubborn part of her heart refused to surrender hope entirely. For the man who had held her hand at the Royal Academy, who had asked if she was brave enough to choose what mattered, who had kissed her in his study with such desperate tenderness, that man loved her. She was certain of it, and if there was even the smallest chance that he had found a way to move forward, to choose the future over the past, then she owed it to herself and to him to come to Vauxhall one last time, to trust him one last time, even knowing it might destroy her. The carriage ride to Vauxhall seemed to take both forever and no time at all, and as they approached the gardens, Arabella noticed something strange. Far more traffic than usual for a Thursday evening, crowds of people streaming toward the entrance, their faces animated with curiosity and excitement, and she heard snatches of conversation as her carriage slowed. Never seen anything like it. The Duke has gone mad. 1,000 lights. And her confusion deepened even as something like anticipation began to flutter in her chest. For whatever was happening, it involved Sebastian, and it was apparently spectacular enough to draw half of London. The entrance to Vauxhall was dark, as always at this hour, the gates standing open to admit the growing crowd. But as Arabella stepped down from her carriage and dismissed her driver with a wave, she would find her own way home, whatever happened tonight. She could see a strange glow emanating from somewhere deeper in the gardens, a radiance that seemed to pulse and shimmer in the gathering dusk, and she could hear music as well, the strains of an orchestra playing something beautiful and achingly romantic. And her heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat as she walked through the entrance gates and followed the flow of people toward the source of the light. The path curved through the usual dark groves and shadowed pavilions, but ahead, in the distance, Arabella could see what looked like a sunrise in the wrong direction, a golden glow that seemed to set the very air on fire. And as she rounded the final bend and the dark walk came into view, she stopped so suddenly that someone behind her nearly crashed into her. But she barely noticed, barely breathed, for what she was seeing was impossible, beautiful beyond measure, a sight that made her eyes fill with tears and her hand fly to her mouth to hold back a sound that was half sob and half laugh. The dark walk had been transformed entirely, utterly, magnificently. Every tree along the quarter-mile avenue was wrapped and hung with hundreds of silk lanterns in jewel colors, ruby and sapphire and emerald and gold, and they glowed from within like captured stars, turning the foliage into something out of a fairy tale. And suspended from the strongest branches were crystal chandeliers that caught and multiplied the light into 1,000 glittering fragments. And lining both sides of the path were ornate candelabras, dozens of them, creating a river of flame that flowed down the center of the avenue, and woven through all of this, threaded between leaves and branches, were thousands of tiny lights like fireflies frozen in place, and the effect was breathtaking, overwhelming, a tunnel of pure radiance where darkness had once held sway, night transformed into something more brilliant than day. And Arabella stood at the entrance to this corridor of light and felt her careful composure shatter completely, felt tears stream down her face as understanding crashed over her in waves. Sebastian had done this, had created this, had spent what must have been a fortune to illuminate the place where he had abandoned her, and the symbolism was so clear, so perfect, so utterly him, bringing light to darkness, transforming the sight of his greatest failure into a declaration of love, risking everything on a grand gesture that would either win her heart or become the most spectacular romantic failure in London's history. And Arabella loved him for it, loved him for his extravagance and his vulnerability and his willingness to make himself ridiculous in front of all society if it meant proving his devotion. And she began to walk down the illuminated avenue with tears still streaming and her heart so full she thought it might burst. As she moved deeper into the light, she noticed details that made her cry harder. Some of the lanterns had words written on them in Sebastian's distinctive hand, quotes from their conversations over the past weeks. "You see what others miss. You make me want to be worthy. You are remarkable." And woven between these were apologies. "Forgive me. I was wrong. I abandoned you." And declarations, "I love you. Choose me. Stay." And she stopped to read them, her fingers brushing the silk as though she could touch him through the words, as though this forest of light was an extension of his heart made visible. And she understood now why he had needed to do this, why words alone would never have been enough. For some truths were too large for language and required grand gestures to contain them, required 1,000 lights to express what 1,000 words could not. At the end of the walk, at the very spot where he had left her standing alone in the darkness weeks ago, Sebastian waited, and even from a distance Arabella could see he was dressed in formal evening attire, black coat and white waistcoat and perfectly tied cravat. But his face held an expression she had never seen before. Naked vulnerability mixed with desperate hope, the Duke's usual mask of control completely abandoned in favor of raw, honest emotion. And as she drew closer, she saw that his hands were shaking, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. And when she was perhaps 10 feet away, he did something that made the crowd gathered at the edges of the walk gasp audibly. He dropped to one knee before her, there in front of hundreds of watching eyes, a duke kneeling in the dirt of a pleasure garden, and the humility of it, the public surrender of dignity and pride, made Arabella's breath catch and fresh tears spill down her cheeks. "I abandoned you in darkness, Arabella," Sebastian said, and his voice was loud enough to carry to the watching crowd, but also intimate, meant only for her. "I left you alone and afraid in this place, and no words can undo that. No apology can erase the hurt I caused. So I offer you this instead, 1,000 lights to replace the darkness, a corridor of radiance where shadow once reigned, and the promise, the vow, that I will never leave you in shadow again, that I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you walk in light, that you are seen and cherished and loved as you deserve." And Arabella tried to speak, but her throat was too tight with emotion, tried to tell him to stand up, that he did not need to kneel, but he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush as though he had been holding them back for too long and could no longer contain them. "This is madness," Arabella managed finally, her voice breaking. "The expense. Sebastian, you must have spent a fortune. This is too much." But he shook his head fiercely, his own tears finally spilling over. "No," he said, "no. It is not too much. You are worth every candle in Sud. London, every star in the sky. You are worth everything I have and everything I am. I would bankrupt myself 1,000 times over if it meant proving to you that I have changed, that I am no longer the man who chose ghosts over living women, duty over love, that I see you, Arabella, truly see you, and what I see is the woman I want to spend my life with, the woman who saved me from myself, who demanded honesty when I wanted to hide, who stood beside me even when I did not deserve it. And I am not asking if you will marry me. I am asking if you will let me spend my life loving you as you deserve, completely and without reservation, with my whole heart and my whole self." Arabella felt her knees weaken, and she reached out blindly, her hands finding his shoulders, gripping them for support, and she looked down into his upturned face and saw love there, real and undeniable. Not the idealized passion of youth, but the deeper, truer love of two people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen each other anyway. And she knew her answer, had known it from the moment she saw the first lantern, perhaps had known it from the moment he held her hand at the Royal Academy. But she needed him to understand something first, needed to make her own terms clear. "Stand up," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I will not have you on your knees, Sebastian. I do not want your submission or your penance. I want your partnership. I want to walk beside you as an equal, not be worshipped from below." And Sebastian rose immediately, hope blazing in his eyes. And Arabella reached up to cup his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away his tears as her own continued to fall. "You absurd, wonderful man," she said, half laughing, half crying. "You have created the scandal of the season, spent a fortune on lanterns, knelt in the dirt before half of London, all to tell me what I already knew, that you love me. And I do not need 1,000 lanterns, you fool. I do not need grand gestures or public declarations. I just need you, your true self. Not the Duke with his titles and responsibilities, not the grieving lover haunted by the past. Just you, Sebastian, flawed and human and trying so hard to be better. That is who I love. That is who I choose." Sebastian let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, or both, his hands coming up to cover hers where they rested on his face. "Then you shall have me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All of me. The flawed and human parts, the Duke and the man, the past and the future, for the rest of our days. If you will have me, Arabella, if you are brave enough to choose this, to choose us." And Arabella smiled through her tears, a radiant, joyful smile that transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said simply, "1,000 times yes. I choose you. I choose us. I choose this madness and this love and this future we will build together." And before she could say anything else, Sebastian pulled her into his arms and kissed her. The kiss was everything their previous kisses had promised, but it held back from fully delivering. Passionate and unrestrained and utterly improper for such a public setting. And neither of them cared. Not about the hundreds of watching eyes or the rules of society or what the scandal sheets would print tomorrow. For in that moment they were both exactly where they needed to be, in each other's arms, in the light, choosing each other freely and without reservation. And the crowd erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the very lanterns overhead, and Arabella could hear her mother's voice somewhere in the din, crying happy tears, and Lord Edmund's laugh, surprised and delighted, and 100 other voices celebrating their joy. But it all faded to background noise as Sebastian deepened the kiss, and Arabella wrapped her arms around his neck and let herself fall completely into the moment, into the promise of everything to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Sebastian kept his arms around her waist and rested his forehead against hers, and Arabella saw in his eyes something she had never seen before: absolute peace, the settled certainty of a man who had finally found his way home after wandering lost for years. And she knew the same peace was reflected in her own gaze, the quiet joy of being truly seen and truly chosen. And as if on cue, as though Sebastian had orchestrated every detail of this moment, which, she realized, he almost certainly had, fireworks exploded overhead, brilliant cascades of color that rivaled the lanterns below, and the crowd gasped and pointed and laughed, and Arabella looked up at the shower of light and then back at Sebastian with mock exasperation. "You commissioned fireworks, too," she said, shaking her head in amused disbelief. "You really are determined to bankrupt yourself for me." And Sebastian grinned, unrepentant and utterly joyful in a way she had never seen him. "Completely worth it," he said. "Besides, I am a duke. I will recover financially. But I would never have recovered from losing you. You are worth every penny, every scandalous headline, every raised eyebrow from disapproving matrons. You are worth everything." And Arabella laughed and kissed him again, shorter this time, but no less heartfelt, and whispered against his lips, "Good, because you are stuck with me now, Your Grace, for better or worse, in darkness and in light." And Sebastian whispered back, "I light a candle for you every night, you know, in my bedchamber. One candle to remember these 1,000, to remind myself of the night I finally chose correctly." And Arabella pulled back to look at him with shining eyes. "One is enough," she said softly. "You are enough, Sebastian. You have always been enough." 1 year later, Arabella walked through the entrance to Vauxhall Gardens with her husband's hand warm and solid in hers, and their daughter balanced on her hip, a perfect cherub of 7 months with Sebastian's, dark hair and her own amber eyes, and she felt a swell of contentment so profound it took her breath away. For this ordinary moment of family happiness was worth more than all the 1,000 lanterns and fireworks and grand gestures, though she cherished those memories too, kept them like treasures in her heart to take out and admire on difficult days. The dark walk was back to its normal state now, the lanterns and chandeliers long since removed, though Sebastian had confided that he was still paying off several chandlers and that the Vauxhall Gardens master occasionally sent him wistful notes, wondering if His Grace might consider repeating the spectacular display for special occasions. Requests Sebastian politely declined, for the 1,000 lights had been a once-in-a-lifetime declaration, never to be repeated or diminished by imitation. "We do not need them anymore," he had told Arabella when she teased him about the notes. "We have each other, we have Bella, we have our life together. What more light could we possibly need?" And she had kissed him, and told him he had become impossibly romantic in his old age, and he had laughed and pulled her close and said it was entirely her fault for teaching him what love really meant. Now they walked the shadowed avenue hand in hand, their daughter, Georgiana Arabella, called Bella by everyone who knew her, looking around with wide, curious eyes, too young to understand the significance of this place, but old enough to sense her parents' emotion. And when they reached the midpoint of the walk, the exact spot where Sebastian had knelt a year ago, where he had abandoned Arabella in darkness weeks before that, he stopped and raised Arabella's hand to his lips, kissing it with a tenderness that still, after a year of marriage, made her heart flutter. "I light a candle for you every night, you know," he said, repeating the words he had whispered a year ago. "In our bedchamber, one candle to remember the 1,000, to remind myself how lucky I am, how close I came to losing you." And Arabella shifted Bella to her other hip and reached up to touch Sebastian's face with her free hand. "One is enough," she said, echoing her response from that night. "You are enough. You have always been enough." And then, because she could not resist, she added with a mischievous smile, "Though I do appreciate that you named our daughter after your dead former betrothed, that is not at all strange or potentially awkward." And Sebastian laughed, the free, unguarded laugh that he had learned in their year together, that came more easily now than it ever had before. "We named her after two women who changed my life," he said. "Georgiana, who taught me what it meant to grieve and let go, and you, Arabella, who taught me what it means to live and move forward. She carries both of your names because she represents both the past I have made peace with and the future I am building with you." And Arabella felt tears prick her eyes. Happy tears, the kind she cried often now, for joy had a way of overwhelming her in the best possible way. And she leaned in to kiss her husband softly. "Our daughter is going to grow up with the most ridiculous origin story," she murmured against his lips. "Your father lit 1,000 lanterns to win my heart. How will any of her suitors ever compete with that?" And Sebastian pulled back with a wicked grin. "Good," he said. "Let them try and fail. She can stay at home with us until she is 40. And Arabella laughed and swatted his arm, and they began walking again, emerging from the dark walk into the illuminated main gardens, where lanterns, a normal, reasonable number of lanterns, cast warm pools of light across the paths and pavilions, and the orchestra played in the distance, and families and couples strolled in the summer evening. And Arabella looked at her small family, her husband and her daughter, and felt the settled certainty of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. They walked together from shadow into light, from the dark avenue into the glowing gardens, from the past into the future. And if Sebastian glanced back once at the dark walk behind them, Arabella understood. They would never forget where they had been, what they had overcome. But they would not live there any longer, would not let the shadows define them, for they had learned the most important truth of all, that love was not about grand gestures alone, but about daily choices, about choosing each other again and again in darkness and in light, in struggle and in joy, in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a life. And as they walked through Vauxhall's gates and toward their waiting carriage, stepping out into the London evening with their daughter between them, Arabella knew that this was the true happy ending, not the 1,000 lanterns, or the public proposal, or the fairy tale romance, but this simple, profound choosing of each other, this commitment to walk together wherever the path might lead, this love that had been tested and proven true, this family they had created together, this future they were building one day, one moment, one choice at a time, always moving from shadow into light, always together, always home.